The question of ascent is one that has perpetually fascinated historians and royal observers. How did a princess raised in the shadows of obscurity and what could only be described as genteel poverty navigate the intricate, treacherous currents of royal politics to place herself at the undisputed center of the British Empire at its absolute zenith? We believe these historical stories deserve to be told, and that the legacies of figures like Queen Mary, who shaped an institution and an era, are more relevant than ever. If you found this deep dive insightful and agree that this history is worth preserving, please show your support by giving this video a like. To ensure you don't miss our future explorations into the figures and events that defined our world, please subscribe to the channel and ring the bell for notifications. And finally, the greatest way to support our work is to share this video with others who you believe would appreciate this fascinating story. Princess Victoria Mary of Teck, known affectionately to her family as May, was not born to the main line of succession, nor was she considered in her youth a likely candidate for a throne of any significance. Her station was uniquely and perpetually precarious. Her father, Francis, Duke of Teck, was the product of a morganatic marriage, granting him a grand title, but no claim to the throne of Württemberg, and more practically, almost no income. Her mother, Princess Mary Adelaide of Cambridge, was a granddaughter of King George III and a first cousin to Queen Victoria. She possessed the vital, royal blood, but was equally notorious at court for her crippling extravagance, immense physical girth, and a resulting mountain of debt that constantly embarrassed the royal family. This dire financial instability, a direct result of her mother's inability to live within their modest means, forced the family into a form of near exile from 1883 to 1885. Fleeing their creditors, they decamped from their grace and favor apartment at White Lodge in Richmond Park to live more cheaply on the continent, primarily in Florence. This period was not a grand tour, it was a humiliation. Yet this upbringing, far from the opulent heart of the monarchy and defined by the constant grinding anxiety of unpaid bills, forged in May a character of profound and steely opposites. She became intensely shy and reserved, yet hyper-observant. She developed a deep, almost pathological frugality that would last her entire life. And she possessed an almost obsessive devotion to duty, order, and protocol, perhaps as a direct psychological reaction to the emotional and financial chaos of her childhood. She was, in the cold calculus of the royal marriage market, a poor relation, a peripheral figure in the grand dynastic tapestry, viewed as dowdy, serious, and lacking the fashionable charisma of the Marlborough house set. Yet it was precisely this understated seriousness, this visible aura of steadfastness, her unimpeachable royal lineage, however distant, and her Protestant German-English background that made her an unexpectedly ideal candidate in the eyes of the ultimate dynastic strategist, Queen Victoria, who in surveying the field for a bride for the heir presumptive, sought not charm, but stability for the future of the throne. The choice was neither romantic nor spontaneous. It was a calculated, strategic, and almost cold-blooded move by an aging monarch desperate to secure the line of succession for her dynasty. Queen Victoria, the Grand Matriarch of Europe, had spent decades meticulously arranging the marriages of her children and grandchildren, weaving a web of familial connections across the continent. Now, in her final years, her most critical task was finding a suitable consort for the man who stood second in line to the throne. Her grandson, Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence, known to the family as Eddie. This engagement was to be the single most significant event of May's young life, a breathtaking elevation from the fringes of royal society to the very threshold of supreme power. Prince Eddie, as the eldest son of the popular and gregarious Prince of Wales, the future King Edward VII, was one day expected to be king himself. However, he was a deeply problematic heir. Listless, languid, lacking in intellectual rigor, and notoriously unfocused, his reputation had already been tarnished by a series of rumors and scandals. Most notably, the baseless but damaging speculation surrounding his potential involvement in the Cleveland Street affair, a scandal involving a male brothel. His tutors had lamented his inability to concentrate, and his own father fretted over his apathy. Queen Victoria, observing her wayward grandson, saw in the shy, serious, self-possessed, and impeccably dutiful May the perfect, stabilizing influence. She was not a glamorous choice, but she was a safe one. She was the corrective ballast for his wandering nature, a woman whose entire character seemed designed to promote duty over pleasure. For May, the engagement, which was settled in late 1891, was the ultimate validation. The future that had once seemed so uncertain, so dependent on the charity of her relations, was now secured in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. She was poised to become the future Queen Empress, the consort to the King of the United Kingdom, and Emperor of India, the most powerful position a woman could hold in the world. The family had gathered at Sandringham, the royal family's private estate in Norfolk, to celebrate Prince Albert Victor's 28th birthday in early January 1892. The atmosphere was one of anticipation. The wedding was planned for just weeks later, on February 27th, and the nation was preparing for the grand spectacle. Then, disaster struck with the indiscriminate, terrifying swiftness of the era. The devastating influenza pandemic that was sweeping the globe, what was then known as the Russian flu, and which had already killed thousands, infiltrated the royal estate. Prince Eddie, who had been feeling unwell, fell gravely ill, his condition quickly deteriorating into pneumonia. In an age before antibiotics, this was a virtual death sentence, even for a prince. The royal family kept a desperate vigil by his bedside, but his fever raged and he grew delirious. On January 14, 1892, just 6 days after his birthday and barely a month after his engagement, the heir presumptive was dead. The shock to the nation was profound. It was a sudden, tragic end to a prince they had been told was their future. But for May, the event was a personal and existential catastrophe on a scale that is difficult to comprehend. Her entire, meticulously constructed future, the future for which she had been precisely chosen and groomed, vanished overnight. The wedding dress was ready, the presents were arriving, the plans were set, and suddenly she was no longer the future queen. She was left in a state of suspended animation, a grieving fiancée in a public role that no longer existed. Her position at court, once so gloriously elevated, was now rendered terrifyingly ambiguous. At 24, she was a fiancée to a dead prince, a woman whose singular purpose had been extinguished, leaving her with no clear royal role and an utterly uncertain path forward. Once again, a poor relation, but this time with the added, tragic burden of public pity. In the rigid, pragmatic, and unsentimental calculus of 19th-century dynastic politics, a princess of May's caliber, dutiful, healthy, Protestant, of royal blood, and already vetted by Queen Victoria herself, was too valuable an asset to be left in limbo. Queen Victoria, though genuinely grieving, was ever the pragmatist and saw a clear and logical solution to two problems at once. The tragic death of the heir had instantly elevated his younger brother, Prince George, Duke of York, to the position of heir presumptive. George was now second in line to the throne, and he was unmarried. George was the spare, a man entirely different from his brother. He was a dedicated professional sailor in the Royal Navy, having spent his entire adult life in service, and he was reserved conservative and possessed the same profound, almost crushing sense of duty that defined May herself. He was unintellectual but practical, shy, and had a sailor's quarterdeck language, famously sporting a large tattoo of a dragon. He was also, by all accounts, devastated by the loss of his brother. In the shared, cloistered period of mourning that followed Eddie's death, George and May found a common ground of grief that evolved into a quiet, mutual respect. They were the two people most directly affected by the tragedy, their lives equally upended. Encouraged heavily by Queen Victoria, who saw the perfect logical pairing, and by their own parents, Prince George proposed to his late brother, his fiancée, at the home of his sister in May 1893. Bound by her unflagging sense of duty, the pragmatic guidance of the Queen, and the realization that this was, once again, her best and only path, May accepted. It was a solution that served the state, the monarchy, and their own futures. On July 6, 1893, they were married in the Chapel Royal, St. James's Palace. May's destiny, so brutally interrupted, was re-established. She would be queen after all, just with a different, and as history would prove, far more suitable king. The accession of her husband to the throne in 1910, following the 9-year reign of his father, King Edward VII, was the catalyst for her final, profound transformation. The shy, reserved Mary of Teck, the dutiful Duchess of York, the apprentice Princess of Wales, was eclipsed by the formidable, imposing, and instantly iconic public persona of Queen Mary. This was not merely a change of title. It was the conscious and deliberate construction of an icon, an image of monarchy she believed was essential for its survival in a rapidly changing world. In an era of burgeoning socialism, rising Republican sentiment, the violent campaign for women's suffrage, and seismic global change, Mary understood, perhaps more clearly than her husband, that the monarchy's survival depended on it appearing infallible, unchanging, and sacrosanct. She cultivated an image of unbending duty, icy formality, and rigid, impenetrable protocol. Her legendary fashion, or more accurately, her anti-fashion, was central to this. She famously froze her style in the Edwardian mode, adopting the signature toque hats, the high-collared, floor-length gowns, the rigid bodices, and the ever-present ropes of pearls and diamonds. This became a form of royal armor, a uniform that made her instantly recognizable and, more importantly, timeless. It was a deliberate rejection of the frivolity of contemporary fashion, projecting instead an image of majestic consistency. She rarely smiled in public, believing her role was not to be loved or relatable, but to be revered as a living symbol of the nation's continuity and the empire's majesty. While privately possessed of a dry wit, a keen intelligence, and a genuine passion for art, her public self became the steel backbone the monarchy required, a bulwark of tradition against the chaotic tides of modernity. She was the immovable object against which the institution could anchor itself. This obsession with protocol and the tangible, visible majesty of the monarchy extended directly to its most valuable assets. Queen Mary became one of the most formidable, dedicated, knowledgeable, and as many contemporary observers whispered, ruthless collectors of royal artifacts and jewels in British history. Her motivation, however, was not personal greed or a simple love of shiny things. It was a deep, institutional imperative. She believed passionately that the artifacts, art, furniture, and especially the jewels were the patrimony of the crown, not the personal property of individuals, and that their purpose was to project the dynasty's power, history, and permanence. She viewed with disdain the way previous generations, particularly her profligate in-laws, had dispersed, sold off, or gifted priceless items from the royal collection. She therefore embarked on a lifelong systematic quest to regather these lost treasures. Her methods were legendary and struck fear into the hearts of aristocratic hosts across Britain. She would visit the great aristocratic houses, often armed with her own encyclopedic knowledge, and upon admiring a particular piece of furniture art or jewelry would famously remark that it had once belonged to a royal ancestor, or that it ought to belong to the crown. The hint was so immense, the implicit pressure from the Queen Empress so undeniable that few could refuse, and the item would invariably be gifted back to the royal collection, often with a thank you note from the Queen arriving before the item had even left the house. This systematic regathering from the pursuit of the Cambridge emeralds to the reorganization of the crown jewels was essential to her vision, to restore the glittering, untouchable, and awe-inspiring image of the dynasty, ensuring its visual splendor matched its constitutional significance. When the Great War erupted in 1914, shattering the old European order and plunging Britain into a new and terrifying total war, Queen Mary's carefully constructed persona of unbending, selfless duty found its ultimate expression. She became the very model of national fortitude and royal leadership, the matron of the nation. While her husband, King George V, visited the front lines to rally the troops, Mary commanded the home front, leading by stark personal example. She immediately imposed strict, self-enforced rationing at Buckingham Palace, ordering the royal kitchens to adhere to the same constraints as the general public, a symbolic act of solidarity that resonated deeply across a nation facing food shortages. But her efforts were far from merely symbolic. She tirelessly toured the country, descending into the grime and danger of munitions factories to encourage the munitionettes, the women who had taken up the dangerous work of building shells. She visited shipyards, and most profoundly, she undertook the emotionally grueling and often horrific work of visiting wounded soldiers in hospitals. She sat with thousands of horrifically injured and dying men suffering from wounds the world had never seen before, mustard gas burns, shell shock, and catastrophic amputations. Her public image of icy formality, which some had seen as a weakness, now became her greatest strength. She could walk through wards of unimaginable suffering, offering quiet comfort and order without flinching or collapsing, embodying the nation's resolve. She also famously organized national drives and knitted tirelessly, personally producing countless scarves and comforts for the troops at the front. She understood that in this new age of total war, the monarchy must not be seen to be above the conflict. It must be seen to serve and suffer alongside its people. The First World War unleashed a wave of ferocious anti-German hysteria across Britain, and this presented an acute and existential crisis for the royal family. The connection was not academic. The king's primary foe, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, was his first cousin. The royal family's very name, Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, was blatantly and unmistakably German, a legacy of Queen Victoria's marriage to Prince Albert. When German Gotha G-4 bombers began appearing in the skies over London in 1917, dropping bombs on British citizens, the family's name became a dangerous liability, a potent tool for Republican and socialist propaganda that painted the king as a German leading a war against his own cousins. The king, driven by the astute advice of his private secretary, Lord Stamfordham, conceived a brilliant and radical public relations move. The family would renounce all their German titles and adopt a new, quintessentially English surname. Queen Mary, despite her own proud German heritage as a Princess of Teck, her father was German and she was fluent in the language, instantly supported the decision with her characteristic pragmatism. She understood, with ice-cold clarity, that duty to the British crown and the survival of the monarchy superseded any personal loyalties to lineage or heritage. In 1917, by royal proclamation, the German name was erased. The family's German relatives, like the Battenbergs, anglicized their name to Mountbatten. The Tecks, Mary's own brothers, became the Marquess of Cambridge and the Earl of Athlone. And the royal house itself, after sifting through historical options, adopted the new, enduring, and perfectly branded House of Windsor, named after the ancient castle that symbolized the very heart of the British establishment. The same rigid, demanding, and unbending formality that defined her public life was, tragically for her children, the defining feature of her private life as a mother. Queen Mary raised her children not with warmth, physical affection, or emotional intimacy, but with the same distant, critical adherence to protocol that she expected of herself and everyone else at court. In keeping with the upper-class customs of the era, the children David, Bertie, Mary, Henry, George, and John were primarily raised by a fleet of nannies and tutors. They were presented to their parents for a formal, brief children's hour each day, an event that was often more of an inspection than a loving reunion. This emotional austerity was compounded by her husband, King George V, who was a harsh, naval-style disciplinarian, famously barking at his children and demanding absolute obedience. This combination of a cold, critical mother and a terrifying, short-tempered father had profound and lasting effects on her heirs. Her eldest son, David, the future Edward VIII, grew into a charming, charismatic, and deeply rebellious figure who craved the emotional affection and validation he never received at home. He came to loathe the rigid duty his mother embodied, seeing it as a prison. Her second son, Bertie, the future George VI, was shy, sensitive, and plagued by a debilitating stutter. His anxiety profoundly exacerbated by this harsh, unloving upbringing and a constant, impossible desire to live up to his father's demanding standards. She demanded duty above all, but in doing so, she created in one son a desperate need to escape that duty at all costs, and in the other, a paralyzing, lifelong fear of it. On January 20th, 1936, her world tilted on its axis. King George V, her partner of over 4 decades, died at Sandringham, ending a partnership that had defined her entire adult life and successfully stabilized the monarchy through a world war and the Great Depression. As the nation mourned the passing of the sailor king, Queen Mary, now 68, became the Queen Mother, a position of immense moral authority and the undisputed matriarch of the dynasty. Her eldest son, David, the charismatic, modern, golden-haired idol of the people, ascended the throne as King Edward VIII. The public was jubilant, seeing in him a new, modern kind of monarch. But Queen Mary, who knew him better than anyone, was filled with a cold, private dread. She knew her son's celebrated character far better than the adoring crowds. She had long recognized his undeniable charm as a mask for a deep-seated selfishness, a profound aversion to the hard, dull, day-to-day work of monarchy, and a rebellious streak that she saw not as modern or refreshing, but as dangerously self-indulgent and unstable. She and George V had long worried about his future, about his string of affairs with married women, and his clear distaste for court life. A prediction, often attributed to his father, echoed in her mind, that the boy would ruin himself within a year of his father's death. Now, as the new King Edward VIII began to neglect his state papers, prioritize his social life, and show a clear disinterest in the constitutional requirements of his role, Queen Mary could only watch in terror as her worst, most private fears began to rapidly and publicly unfold. The crisis, when it arrived later that year, was precisely the catastrophe of character Queen Mary had feared, but in a form she could never have predicted. The crisis was Wallis Simpson. To the new king, Mrs. Simpson, an American, a socialite, and, critically, a woman in the process of her second divorce, was the love of his life, the sophisticated, witty, and dominant woman for whom he would sacrifice everything. To Queen Mary, she was, simply and dismissively, that woman. The objections were not merely, as some suggested, a matter of social snobbery, though Mrs. Simpson's status as a twice-divorced commoner with a questionable reputation was certainly an affront to the Queen's rigid sensibilities. The true barriers were constitutional and, for Mary, theological. The king was the supreme governor of the Church of England, an institution which at the time did not permit remarriage after divorce if the former spouse was still living. Both of Mrs. Simpson's former husbands were very much alive. For the king to marry her was a constitutional impossibility, and in Mary's eyes, a spiritual betrayal of his coronation oath. While the government under Stanley Baldwin and the Dominions wrestled with the political and constitutional ramifications, Queen Mary's fury was focused squarely on her son. She saw his intention not as a romantic dilemma, but as a monstrous, selfish, and juvenile choice. He was placing his personal desire for a woman she considered deeply unsuitable above his sacred God-given oath to his people and his empire. It was the antithesis of everything she stood for, the ultimate negation of her entire life's work. Personal happiness over his inherited role formally abdicated the throne, famously declaring his inability to carry the heavy burden of responsibility without the help and support of the woman I love. To Queen Mary, this act was the ultimate, unforgivable sin, a complete and total dereliction of duty. It was a betrayal of his father's legacy, his country, and his God. She was famously cold and unforgiving, refusing to ever receive Wallis Simpson, whom she blamed for the entire affair, and treating her eldest son, now demoted to the Duke of Windsor, as a pariah and an exile. She actively supported the decision to deny Wallis the title of Her Royal Highness, a slight that would sting the Windsors for the rest of their lives. But Queen Mary did not collapse in grief. With the institution she had given her life to now teetering on the brink of collapse, her iron-willed resolve immediately and decisively pivoted. The crown, and all its burdens, had passed to her terrified, stuttering second son Bertie, who had never wanted nor expected to be king. As he wept at the news of his new, crushing responsibility, she did not coddle him, she bolstered him. In one of the most powerful symbolic acts of the entire transition, Queen Mary, his 69-year-old mother, was the very first member of the royal family to perform a deep formal curtsy to him as the new King George VI. In that single powerful gesture, she was reminding him, his family, and the world that the individual was temporary, but the crown was eternal. She would now dedicate the rest of her life to ensuring this son, the one who feared duty, would succeed where her first, the one who rejected it, had so catastrophically failed. Now in her 70s, and the mother of the reigning king, Queen Mary entered a new phase as the ultimate matriarch of the nation, and the outbreak of the Second World War in 1939 gave her a final, great public stage. She became the living embodiment of Victorian steadfastness, a direct, regal link to a past of British imperial certainty in a world that was once again descending into chaos. The government, deeply fearing for her safety as a potent symbolic target, strongly advised her to evacuate to the safety of Canada, alongside other European royals who were fleeing the continent. Her refusal was absolute, instantaneous, and withering. She would not leave her son, the king, or her country in its hour of peril. She spent most of the war at Badminton House in Gloucestershire, but she was far from idle. During the darkest days of the Blitz, she refused to cower. When Buckingham Palace was bombed in September 1940, while her son and daughter-in-law King George VI and Queen Elizabeth were in residence, she famously remarked that she was almost glad it had happened, as it meant they could look the East End in the face, a sentiment that perfectly captured the new shared solidarity of the monarchy with its people. Just as she had in the First War, she embarked on morale-boosting tours, visiting troops, inspecting factories, and walking with her characteristic, unbending posture through the bombed-out ruins of London neighborhoods, an unbending, regal figure whose very presence was a defiant symbol of Britain's refusal to be broken. In 1952, Queen Mary, now in her mid-80s, endured the final great sorrow of her long life. She buried another son. King George VI, the shy, stuttering man who had, with her unwavering support, so dutifully and bravely redeemed the monarchy after the abdication, died in his sleep at Sandringham. His health had been broken by the immense strain of wartime leadership and a lifetime of heavy smoking and anxiety. He was only 56. She had now outlived 3 of her 6 children, her youngest, John, in 1919, her son George, Duke of Kent, in a 1942 air crash, and now her son the King. Though privately devastated, Queen Mary's public response was, as always, rooted in her unshakable sense of duty and the continuity of the institution. At her son's lying in state at Westminster Hall, a photographer captured one of the most iconic and symbolic images of the 20th century, the Three Queens photograph. It depicted 3 generations of queens veiled in black paying their respects to the dead king. Queen Mary, the Victorian grandmother, and Matriarch, the living symbol of the past. Queen Elizabeth, the newly widowed and beloved Queen Mother, the symbol of the present's grief, and the young, solemn 25-year-old Queen Elizabeth II, who had now inherited the throne, the symbol of the future. In that single powerful image, Queen Mary is the anchor, the symbol of unbroken tradition, and the seamless, solemn transition of power, the matriarch guiding the dynasty and the world to accept the transfer of the crown to her granddaughter.